Molt bon dia a tothom, benvinguts i benvingudes i felicitats i gràcies a la Fira Literal per fer possible aquesta conversa amb qui sabeu que és una de les figures més influents del pensament crític contemporani, que és el professor Eagleton. Benvingut a Barcelona, a la Fira Literal, i gràcies per ser aquí. Permeteu-me dos pinzellades abans d'entrar directament en conversa. El professor Eagleton està format, com sabeu molts i moltes, en la riquíssima tradició del marxisme britànic, que ha desenvolupat una trajectòria excepcional com a crític literari, com a teòric cultural, també com a intel·lectual públic, que no ha defugit les batalles d'anàlisi, denúncia i proposta respecte del present, i la seva obra està travessada per una voluntat de transformació social i ha aconseguit una cosa molt poc freqüent en els àmbits acadèmics, que són pròpiament els seus, que és fer dialogar la teoria crítica més exigent amb els conflictes i les urgències del nostre present. No dec ser l'únic, segur que molts de vosaltres els seus llibres han estat referents de vida, referents de militància, referents d'acció. Permeteu-me només esmentar-ne alguns, començant pel del 78, que portava com a títol Literatura i crítica marxista, el del 97, Ideologia, una introducció, el del 99, La funció de la crítica, i en el segle XXI, un text essencial del 2001, que té molt a veure amb el que avui en parlarem, que és la idea de cultura, per suposat del 2004, després de la teoria, és una manera de dir després de la teoria què, i al 2015, dintre dels més recents, Esperança sense optimisme o simplement Cultura del 2016. I celebrem també avui, perquè n'és l'excusa que hagi pogut venir a Barcelona, la edició en català d'un llibre brillant i a més necessari, que és Per què Marx tenia raó, que per si algú no ho té clar no era un títol, no és un títol irònic. Té una obra, com dèiem, ambiciosa, que recorre àmbits de les disciplines acadèmiques molt diferents, però sempre travessat per un impuls i una ambició de justícia. Us he de confessar, perdoneu-me, i dedicaré només 5 segons a la justificació personal, que la preparació d'aquesta conversa és segurament la cosa més difícil que he fet en la meva vida, perquè són més de 30 anys de llegir llibres seus, d'aprendre'n, de qüestionar coses apreses i formades i, per tant, concentrar una conversa en una hora davant de les moltíssimes, com us podeu imaginar, coses que un tindria la tentació i gairebé el pecat que he de contenir de preguntar-li, ho reduirem amb algunes preguntes al voltant de què se'ns proposa, que és parlar de la cultura com a trinxera, com a forma de resistència, com a espai de batalla, per la seva capacitat d'emancipació transformadora i també tots els riscos i problemes que planteja. En tot cas, donem primer de tot la paraula al professor Eagleton, que ens farà una primera intervenció i que ens permetrà ja aquí començar a estirar preguntes, qüestions i debats. Espero que una mica ordenadament.
Thank you. Well, I'm delighted to be back in the city that everybody seems to want to visit. It's always wise to begin with a little flattery of one's audience. And I'd like to dedicate, I won't speak very long, but I'd like to dedicate what I have to say to Maria, who is in the audience. I don't know any particular Maria in the audience, but I'm sure there are lots of Marias. So this is for all the Marias, including men with Maria in their names and so on. What if Marxism were a tragic belief, a tragic philosophy? I mean, you wouldn't think so, would you, given the pathological optimism of certain people on the left? I remember a few years ago when the Orange Lord was first elected in the United States, I mean, Mr. Trump, the Orange Lord, I heard an enthusiastic young socialist in Britain saying that there had never been so many revolutionary opportunities. Now, maybe he'd been sitting with a paper bag over his head in a darkened room for several months, but this seemed a rather extraordinary thing to say. I mean, you know, people who are pathological optimists should remind themselves, surely, that the last time the left in large numbers in the West was on the front foot in insurrectionary mode was half a century ago, a long time. However, the other point to make, surely, is that socialism is such a brilliant idea that it's very hard to eradicate. Socialism is a very hard idea to get rid of because it is such a great idea. I mean, a great idea like, for example, teaching small children how to fasten their shoelaces, or reducing Elon Musk to such a state of destitution that he's forced to tap dance for dimes on Fifth Avenue. Marxists aren't, of course, optimists in the sense of being utopianists. Marx, of course, speaks against utopia very often, and his refusal to speak of the future in positive terms is, I suppose, part of a Jewish prohibition on graven images of the future. You can't have graven images of the God of the future because the only image of God is human beings, is flesh and blood, is men and women. However, that's not what I mean by wondering whether Marxism is a tragic creed. Let me approach the question of whether it is a little indirectly. There are only really two good reasons, in my view, for being a Marxist. First is to annoy people that you don't like. And the second good reason for being a Marxist is not you don't like having to work. Of which more in a moment. Another way you can spot a Marxist is not only somebody who doesn't like to work, but somebody who has lavish praise for the bourgeoisie, yes, which might puzzle our comrade who was sitting with a paper bag over his head in a darkened room. As for not liking to work, Marxism, of course, is about leisure and not about labor. It's about getting rid of work as far as we can so that we can pursue instead the noblest and most sublime of human goals, namely trying to have some fun. To have some fun, we require time and freedom, and for that we need the shortening of the working day, and for that we need the abolition of the profit motive. Yes? And then, once all that is complete, we'll simply lie around all day, you know, in loose crimson garments, in various interesting postures of jouissance, reciting Homer to one another, sipping absinthe, perhaps, maybe reading Proust, in my case, and all that will just be the working day. Yes, that will be the working day. Okay, I won't begin to describe the rest of it. Marx attends to the economic in order to free us from its tyrannical power over us. Yes, I mean, he spoke scathingly of having to deal with what he spending so much time on what he called this economic crap. Yes, and he really wanted to finish writing Capital in order to get back to writing his big book on Balzac. He also remarked about himself that nobody in the history of humankind, had ever written so much on money and had so little. His model of production, his model of non-alienated production was art. And anybody who wants to read up, by the way, on the relation between socialism and idleness, bone idleness, may turn to Oscar Wilde's great work, The Soul of Man Under Socialism. Wilde being, of course, not only a socialist, but an Irish Republican, a compatriot of my own, who believed not that his native Ireland should be free from British rule, but that Ireland should govern Britain. He also once remarked that he lived in perpetual fear of not being misunderstood. He lived in perpetual fear of not being misunderstood. I could say more about the close relations between Wilde's verbal, sexual, and political perversity. In fact, I once wrote a play on all this when most people here were still crawling on all fours. A supremely fine play, I should add, superior in many ways to Hamlet, certainly more worth watching than Hamlet. But I won't say more about my extraordinarily fine play because I'm too modest to do that. So I will turn instead to the second point I made about how to recognize a Marxist, if they aren't dressed in a certain peculiar way. Sometimes they are, and you can recognize them by that, their red hair or green socks or something. But if they're not, then you can recognize Marxists, as I said before, by their extraordinary admiration for the bourgeoisie. I mean, Marx himself certainly seems to think that without commandeering the vast resources accumulated by the European middle classes, not only material resources, but spiritual and cultural ones as well, without somehow commandeering that wealth, the result is likely to be lethal for any attempt to build socialism. Okay? In other words, it's Marxism and not middle-class liberalism which allows us the deepest understanding of Stalinism, of what goes wrong if you're forced to construct socialism in those conditions in which you don't have at your disposal the enormous material and cultural riches of the middle classes. If you're in that situation, then again, as Marx himself puts it, all that will happen is what he calls generalized scarcity and a continuation, as he says, of the same old crap. I don't know if that's an accurate translation from the German. So, in an extraordinary flourish of dialectical thought, for Marx, or Marxists, the bourgeoisie is both adversary and redeemer. The conditions that currently prevent or help to prevent socialist change are also that could, in a different situation, actually facilitate it. Lenin once made a very insightful and deft remark. I'm reluctant to use the word deft, meaning insightful, because I once used it in a talk I gave, and everybody thought I said that Lenin was deaf. I don't think Lenin was deaf, as far as I know, but I had a lot of explaining to do that he wasn't. Lenin once says that it was the absence of civil society in pre-Bolshevik Russia which helped to facilitate the revolution, but it was the same absence which, once it had been made it very hard to sustain. Well, obviously Marx himself thought that it was possible to have historical shortcuts from capitalism to socialism, and the Bolsheviks tried one of them on. But a lot of mainstream Marxism has, of course, still believes, that you need those riches to be accumulated in the first place as part of the conditions of what you want to do. So note what that could mean in principle. It could mean that suffering, injustice, inequality, exploitation are essential if socialism is to happen, because they lie at the root of the magnificent achievements, spiritually and materially, of the middle classes. And that sounds very much like, to use a technical term, like a theodicy. Theodicy being the belief that suffering or wickedness are necessary now because they'll contribute in the fullness of time to something finer and better. I once gave a paper, I think it was in Toronto, not quite sure, the title of which was Marxism and Theodicy. And I began by apologizing for using an obscure word in the title, namely Marxism. I remember that paper peculiarly well because I was driven to the conference by a young woman who I didn't know, who at one point said that she and her partner had spent years trying to work out how to have a baby. And years trying to work out how to have a baby. I thought of drawing some quick diagrams and handing them over to her until I realized that she was in a lesbian relationship, and there was the problem of whether the donor had certain rights and whether his boyfriend, and a very postmodern situation. But it seemed very strange that they'd been really puzzling their heads for years over this question. I don't think Marx himself was a theodicist in the sense that I don't think he necessarily thought you had to have certain kinds of historical exploitation in order to have socialism, but I certainly think that he thought in some ways in tragic mode. Because what's tragic about tragedy isn't necessarily that it all ends badly, but that for things to end well at all demands an appalling amount of wretchedness and devastation. You can't rise from the dead without first having died and descended into hell. Or as the poet W.B. Yeats puts it, nothing can be soul or whole that has not been rent. If that's true, then we have to ourselves, as leftists, ask ourselves a tough question, which is, if socialism were indeed to arrive, would this justify the historical suffering which, among other things, had gone into its making? How long would such a society need to survive in order to justify that prehistory? Or are these things not possible to quantify? I'll just cut out some rather boring stuff here. Oh, yes. Well, I'll put it in the form of a question. And I won't say, what is it that's peculiar to Marxism? I mean, what is it? What belief do Marxists have that nobody else does? Anything? Is there anything? Not communism, not revolution, not social class, not class struggle, none of those things. So I'll leave you to write your answers on a piece of paper, which we will then collect later on, and meanwhile go on to something else. Okay. And with this I'll end. I mentioned that Marx's idea of non-alienated production is art. And in general, Marx looks to an aestheticizing of life in general. In that, he's very much like his disciple Oscar Wilde. I don't mean that he replaces life with art, which is the most boring and impoverished and uninteresting form of aestheticism. I mean, he wants a society in which men and women can resemble works of art, not because they stand very still in certain postures at the corner of a room. That was meant to be a feeble joke, but don't worry about it. Not in that sense, but he wants them to have the kind of full self-realization that works of art can themselves model. Yes? Not only that, but that in a socialist society or a communist society, you could realize those capacities and freedoms and powers strictly for their own sake, or to use a more technical theological term, strictly for the hell of it. Yes. Art, in other words, for Marx, is an enemy of instrumental reason and an enemy of utilitarian ways of thinking. Like Aristotle, from whom he learns a great deal, he sees morality as being about well-being and thriving and happiness and fulfillment, not, in the first case at least, about duty or obligation or responsibility. He's not a Kantian, though those things, of course, have their place in human life. So that the good life, what Aristotle would call the life of virtue, for Marx is one with a disposition to this self-delighting realization for its own sake, for not for any end beyond it. There are all sorts of problems with that ethic, as there are problems with any ethic, really. One of which I'll touch on very quickly, which is how does that differ from straight, common or garden middle-class liberalism, the individual self-realization? Well, it differs because for Marx, it has to be done reciprocally. When he writes in the Communist Manifesto that the freedom of each is the condition of the freedom of all, he means that one's self-realization has to be done in, through, and by the similar self-realization of others. And that is an example of what you might call political love. Because love at an interpersonal is that at an interpersonal level, where the fulfillment of one person, by and large, can happen in and through the fulfillment of the other. If you project that onto a much wider scale, say a cooperative operates really like that, or indeed a socialist society as a whole. It's not a perfect ethics for not one reason, because Marx doesn't believe in original sin, which is very short-sighted of him. Everybody should believe in original sin, not only in Catholic societies like Spain. Yes. If you want to know more about that, just talk to me after the show. All right, let me just end by saying this. I mentioned power a moment ago. Actually, I didn't. That was cut out. But anyway, let's imagine I did mention power a moment ago. Why not? It's a free country. And I mentioned it in a negative context, which is always a mistake. Leftists are always talking about power as though it's somehow negative. Speaking truth to power, of which my old mate, Noam Chomsky, said two vital things. One, power knows the truth anyway. And it shouldn't be so charitable as to imagine that power doesn't know what's going on. It's just blundering, If only it knew how it was screwing people up, it wouldn't do it. So we need to tell it. No, we don't. It knows perfectly well what it's doing. And secondly, it's not, as Chomsky said, it's not power that needs to know the truth. It's the people who are being exploited by it or oppressed by it. Somebody once described capitalism as private wealth and public squalor. Private wealth and public squalor. True of every capitalist society. Private wealth, Bono once flew his hat first class from New York to Dublin because it was a favourite hat of his that he'd left in New York. And on the other hand, people who are looking for food in garbage cans. And that's what we have. So power, only those who have power can afford to speak of it in negative terms. Left-wingers know, unlike their adversaries, that power is all important. I mean, personally, I can't get enough of it. You know? I'm mad with power. You know? As long as it's held by the right people for the right ends in the right situations. But also leftists know, as their adversaries don't, that the only enduring power, the only fundamental power, the only one that will last is one which springs from a compact with failure, from a compact with weakness. And if you want to talk to name the poet of that condition, it's Samuel Beckett. That indeed is one of the most radical lessons of tragedy, that only through a dispossession so radical and thoroughgoing that few of us have the courage for it, and many of us might not survive it, only in that way can you break through to genuine life. Only if you die can resurrection be possible. And there are absolutely no guarantees that that will come about. If you have the cards of eternal life up your sleeve, you're not going to make it. Yes. Oh, yes. I have a kind of joke that I might end with. People talk about the English being very gradual in terms of the way they think, you know, because of their history. If ever we decide to drive on the right, we shall do so gradually. I don't mean to decide gradually, I mean actually do it gradually. You've been a very pleasant audience. Thank you so much. And in order, we will shortly begin a fascinating, intellectually high-powered, potentially endless conversation. But in order just to thank you, I think what I'd like to do finally is I'll sing you an Irish love song. I come from Ireland, right? It's called, you think I'm joking, don't you? It's called Raglan Road. On Raglan Road, on an autumn day, when I first saw her, I knew that her dark hair would weave a snare that I would one day rue. I saw the danger, but I strode along the enchanted way. And I said, let grief be a fallen leaf at the dawning of the day. On Grafton Street in November, we tripped lightly along the ledge of that deep ravine where can be seen the warmth of passion's pledge. The Queen of Hearts still making tarts, and I not making hay. Oh, I love to march, and by such was happiness thrown away. I gave her gifts of the mind, I gave her the secret sign that's known to the artists who have known great gods of sound and stone. Of words and tint I did not stint. I gave her poems to say, with her own name there and her own dark hair, like flowers over fields of May. In a lonely street where old ghosts meet, I see her walking now, away from me, quite hurriedly. My reason must avow that I have loved not as I should, a creature made of clay. When the angel lose the clay, he'll lose his wings at dawn of day. Thank you very much.
Difícil seguir a partir d'aquí.
This wasn't working before, actually, so I missed those remarks. I don't know if it's working now.
Sí, en tot cas, difícil continuar a partir d'aquí, professor Eagleton. En tot cas, parlarem d'aquesta producció no alienada.
This isn't actually working, guys. Unless it's kind of Bulgarian that's coming through. I don't know. So maybe I can just very, very quickly learn Catalan. Yes. If you just go away for 10 minutes. Yes.
Sí, provem ara, sí?
Is that it? Yeah. Oh.
Ara provarem? Sí?
Yeah.
Arriba bé la traducció? Sí, eh? No, reprendrem una mica a partir... I ja estem vacunats contra la tentació de caure en l'optimisme patològic, si hem de parlar de la cultura, i per tant de creure que la cultura no només ens ho resoldrà tot, sinó que ens permetrà abordar tots els mals.
Could you speak a little, I'm talking to the interpreter, could you speak a little louder, interpreter? Thank you very much. I can hear you now, yes. Okay.
En tot cas, provarem de reflexionar sense... Sí? Ara sí?
Could be better, yes.
Perfecte. Bueno, provarem d'obrir...
Yes. What color eyes do you have, by the way? Yes.
Sí?
What color eyes do you have? Still could be slightly louder, if that's possible. Yeah. Okay. No, you're fine. I think it's because two different sounds are clashing. Yes.
Perfecte, ara sí? No encara?
Well, try again. Anyway, let's try again. This was like trying to make a phone call in China in the early 1980s. You had to shout so loud that you didn't really need the phone at all. You know, they could sort of hear you.
Arrenquem? Sí? Ara sí, eh? Perfecte, i així provem. I si no, passarem directament la paraula, que serà més inspirador segurament. En tot cas, per estirar un dels fils, que és la reflexió al voltant de la cultura, dèiem vacunats contra l'optimisme patològic de pensar que la cultura ha de permetre'ns de protegir-nos de tots els mals i també de resoldre tots els problemes que tenim. Sí que volia preguntar-li al professor Eagleton sobre una cosa de la que n'ha parlat molt sovint, que és enfront de la cultura com un instrument del poder i alhora de la cultura com un instrument del mercat, que són dos àmbits de la reflexió sobre els quals sovint n'ha escrit. I per veure si podem pensar i per escoltar-lo al voltant de la cultura com una eina o un instrument d'emancipació i d'alliberament que no sigui només individual, com de vegades se'ns vol fer creure, sinó d'emancipació i alliberament col·lectiu. I volia preguntar-li primer pel poder, perquè sobre no només una qüestió que n'acaba de parlar, sinó que ocupa el gruix de part de les seves reflexions al voltant de la cultura. I justament d'aquesta idea de la cultura, que la coneixeu, perquè històricament segurament ha estat la més influent, que és la cultura com un instrument al servei del poder, capaç, ell ho ha dit de vegades, capaç la cultura d'endolcir l'autoritat i de fer-la tolerable, fins i tot allà on el poder és literalment intolerable i que de vegades la cultura en seria com el seu cosmètic. Aquest és un fenomen històric des de l'imperi romà, que va omplir tot l'imperi d'estàtues d'August i que avui les mirem als museus, però que en el fons eren una forma de portar el poder polític fins a tots els racons de la Mediterrània, fins al període, per posar-ne algun més recent en el segle XX, de la Guerra Freda, en el qual Estats Units bastia la seva hegemonia en el món militarment, econòmicament i culturalment, però també amb l'ús de la cultura com un instrument de dominació, de conformació d'identitats, etc. En aquest context, jo li volia preguntar al professor Eagleton, perquè d'això n'ha reflexionat sovint, sobre la cultura com a instrument d'emancipació i com a instrument d'alliberament. Insisteixo sense caure en l'optimisme patològic que ens permeti pensar que la cultura de patac és la via que ens porta a la revolució. Però com hauria de ser una cultura capaç d'enfrontar-se, si no al poder polític, als poderosos, que no tingui, com n'ha tingut històricament, la tentació de legitimar les coses, de legitimar l'statu quo. La cultura pot continuar sent avui un instrument d'alliberament, i insisteixo, d'alliberament més col·lectiu que no individual?
I'm afraid I didn't hear any of that. It seems that the interpreter is now either left for lunch or just not coming through. I'm so sorry. Maybe can we? I just can't hear anything. Maybe we should arrange this in some different way.
Sí.
Could somebody just translate what he said?
Translator comes. Clar que sí, millor.
Hi,
Hey,
sorry.
you're the interpreter. Are you?
Blue eyes, I told you.
Oh, blue eyes, blue eyes.
So I hope you can hear me now.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, very good.
La repetim?
Si li vols tornar, no sé si vols tornar a dir tot o...
No, jo crec que no cal repetir-lo tot, però fonamentalment és preguntar-li per la cultura com a instrument d'emancipació i d'alliberament col·lectiu enfront de l'ús històric de la cultura com a instrument de poder, que és una cosa que n'ha parlat sovint.
The question would be around culture as a tool for collective liberation instead of a tool or like a market service, a market product, or a tool for individual liberation.
Yeah.
You've talked about this in your work oftentimes, so we would like to know a little bit more about your thoughts in this point, right? How can culture be understood as a tool for collective liberation without, of course, falling into the trap of pathological optimism?
Ah, yes, yes.
Does it make sense now?
Yes.
If you give me 1 minute, I'll go back to the booth and
Yes.
then I'll go.
This is a,
Gràcies. Moltes gràcies.
That's a bit like a ventriloquist idea, isn't it? Yeah, yeah, I mean, the question is about culture, culture individually and culture collectively. Maybe I could just begin by saying a quick word about the relation between culture and politics. Culture and politics is not, of course, the same thing, although we talk about cultural politics. I think in a certain sense, culture is more fundamental than politics in this sense, that if you take the broad, as it were, anthropological definition of culture as a whole way of life, then culture is what politics has to bed itself down in if it's to be successful. A politics which isn't rooted somehow in a lived culture is going to have problems in that way. So although in certain ways politics takes precedence in terms of the need for urgent action, that can only be understood and developed within the much wider concept of culture. Culture is simply about, how we go about things almost in a spontaneous and unconscious way. And we have to turn politics, which is highly conscious, into a certain taken for granted form of life. And that's very difficult. But it's doing that which enables power to operate. It's because class power works above all at the level of culture, in culture in a broad, everyday sense, that it can be so successful. Culture begins, I suppose, in Europe as an individual concept, meaning essentially cultivation. And then in the 19th century, faced with all sorts of political problems, culture, to survive as a concept, has to collectivize itself. It has to become more corporate. It has to look at the fate of whole classes and societies. And I think that's what's happening in the 19th century, so that by the following century, culture is now a full-blooded field of collective study of its own, and we're on the way to cultural studies and so on. But there are also, of course, extremely important contradictions and conflicts between different meanings of culture, between culture in the, I suppose, the great European Kulturkritik tradition, where culture is essentially an idealist critique of bourgeois society, and culture in more radical or transformative ways. Somebody once said that in the English language, culture is the most complex concept next to nature, which in some theories is its opposite. That's interesting.
Per complementar, i no sé com estarem per la situació de la traducció, El que passa és que no podrà sentir la pregunta. Ho tornarem a fer igual? Ens haureu de... Moltes gràcies, jo crec que serà el més...
I tried to shout, but it didn't work. I'm kidding, I'm kidding.
No, com a complement a la pregunta per la relació entre cultura com a forma no de sotmetiment al poder, no d'instrument del poder, i per tant com a alliberadora, en el llibre Cultura del 2016, Eagleton parla, 2016, per tant no tan lluny, del capitalisme que tenim ara com un capitalisme de rostre cultural. I parla i suggereix d'alguna qüestió que també forma part de les nostres preocupacions actuals, que és que la cultura també actualment, i com a mínim des de que Adorno ho va criticar, en la dialèctica de la il·lustració, la cultura està al servei del mercat, al servei de la indústria, de l'entreteniment, fomentant la comercialització de l'art i de la cultura i uniformant la diversitat cultural en l'àmbit de la indústria cultural o de les indústries, que avui en diem de les indústries culturals. En aquest context també la pregunta o la reflexió sobre la que el professor Eagleton ha dedicat pàgines brillants és com podem articular també formes de producció cultural, formes de cultura, i no només de producció, sinó de circulació i de recepció cultural, al marge del mercat, al marge de les indústries culturals, al marge del que seria la lògica del consum i la cultura de l'entreteniment. És a dir, com és possible una forma de cultura fora o que resisteixi a una lògica voraç, que és justament la lògica del mercat.
Sure, thank you. Well, that's a huge, very large issue. I think it's significant, isn't it, that historically speaking, there's a moment in the late 19th and early 20th century in Europe where popular culture, the culture industry, mass culture, and the high culture of modernism emerge almost simultaneously. And I think we need to study the relations there between the two. Partly, of course, for the obvious reason that much modernism is a kind of last-minute, 11th hour resistance to the tyranny of the commodity. You know, the attempt, impossible really, by the work of art, not to be a commodity, to refuse that kind of status. Yes? And one of the most powerful motivations of that, surely, is exactly the growth of the culture industry, where the two ideas that were traditionally antithetical, culture on the one hand, or the work of art, and the commodity on the other, begin to fuse. Yeah. Now, at the same time as that happens, you also have the emergence of the avant-gardes of various kinds, which is a different thing altogether. I mean, the avant-gardes are also concerned vitally with the fusion or integration of culture and everyday life, but in an anti-commodity spirit, yes. Most of them, anyway. How is one to achieve that kind of fusion between everyday practical existence and the production of culture without simply slavishly surrendering to the sovereignty of the commodity? Yeah, and that's an ongoing question. Let me also say, however, very quickly, that being on the left involves assuming, doesn't it, that culture, however important it may be, isn't where it's at. Yeah? Isn't where it's at. So there's something rather strange, rather, you know the word oxymoron? Contradictory phrase, yeah, like business ethics, for example. There's something rather contradictory about the idea of radical culture, because it's always tempted to give culture a status which is really too high. Or put it another way, I mean, people don't live by culture alone, do they? And they certainly don't live by culture in the first instance, but it's a mistake of cultural idealism of all stripes, of all kinds, to believe that they do. You know, that culture, as it were, both starting point and finishing point. It's not true. I mean, people live by culture in the sense that there's no life without without meaning and value. It's very strange that human beings move in a world of meaning. Meaning is a very mysterious thing, I think. In that sense of culture, a very extended sense of the concept, then surely, culture is the texture of everyday life. It's what's so close to the eyeball that we can hardly even objectify it. It's the color of everyday life, which we take for granted. But when it comes to a political struggle or the realm of politics, for a materialist, it's part of what one means, I suppose, by materialism, that culture is not the priority. It's not the priority. So again, there's something slightly self-contradictory about the phrase cultural materialism. I mean, it's fine, we know what it means, and it can be very useful, but if you press it to a certain point, it begins to come away apart at the seams. Materialism just assumes that the question that has priority is the question of material survival. And we can survive without Beethoven, but we can't survive without bread. So we have to, I think, as people on the left, we have to have a set of priorities. And the whole notion of priority is today very unfashionable, because it's associated with those dreadful things called hierarchies. There are these evil hierarchical people, who believe that tickling children is preferable, is just the same as feeding them. They're on the same level. We must insist, obviously, on an agenda of political priorities. There's nothing hierarchical in the negative sense, I think, about that. Whereas one of many problems with postmodernism is, first of all, to go back to my previous point, it's culturalism. It's belief that culture goes all the way down. Yeah? Culture goes all the way down. I don't believe that. I don't believe that culture goes all the way down. I believe that we're the kinds of material animals who have a whacking great loss or lack in us, which culture has to fill. And in that sense, culture is part of what we are. But it's only because of the nature of the material animal we are that that's so. I mean, in a very simple way, if babies are born with an enormous lack where culture has at some point quickly to be. I don't mean Schoenberg, it's not vital that the baby should listen to Schoenberg, right? Okay. You can laugh at that. But it is vital that culture in the sense of food and care and all that moves in on the baby, otherwise it's going to die. And it's not going to die without Schoenberg. It may be severely emotionally deprived, without reading Locke or whatever, But anyway, so it's a question which predates all specific questions about culture, which is how important is what we're talking about. Yeah. I'm afraid we're going to have to call upon our Redeemer.
10 minuts. Si pot ser, esperarem que pugi. Disculpeu aquesta conversa interrompuda.
Welcome back.
Hi again. Thank you.
Welcome back.
Abordarem una última pregunta pel que m'indiquin i concentrant-nos en el fil obert ara, que és evidentment el resistir-nos a la tentació de convertir la cultura en alguna cosa tan elevada que ens faci pensar que és la qüestió prioritària. No? I, per tant, resistits i vacunats contra això. La qüestió és si avui la batalla per la cultura no és també una batalla pels drets i, per tant, una batalla per l'accés a la cultura, en allò que sovint reclamem com a democratització cultural. És a dir, aquests béns, els culturals, que durant segles han estat, per dir-ho directament, un instrument de classe, no? I un element de distinció, com deia Pierre Bourdieu, que no era només alguna cosa que permetia la formació individual, el creixement individual, sinó que era sobretot una forma d'excloure a parts senceres de la població d'aquest accés a la cultura com a instrument d'emancipació. No? La pregunta seria si avui, perquè torna a ser un debat molt important i també a casa nostra, si la batalla per la democratització cultural, si la batalla per l'accés a la cultura com a dret, no hem entès a hores d'ara que implica també la batalla per modificar les condicions materials de vida. I que, per tant, la batalla per l'accés a la cultura no està deslligat d'una batalla global que afecta a la vida quotidiana, a les desigualtats, a un sistema que exclou a parts de la població no només de participar regulant les formes de producció, sinó també l'accés a la cultura, per concentrar-lo. I una mica, i ho remataré per utilitzar el pa imprescindible, que servirà... Yes? Okay.
Yes, thanks. I think the relation between culture and politics varies, doesn't it? It differs. You can't give a general formula for it. For example, one thing that happens from the end of the 20th century onwards is that the socialist struggle becomes too hard, and we have a shift, this is putting it very schematically, and there's an increasing shift towards identity politics. Now, identity politics, of course, the relation between culture and politics is so close that the two are almost often indistinguishable. But that's not true, on the other hand. We shouldn't take that as a norm. It's not true of many aspects of traditional working class struggle, which certainly involve culture, to be sure, in different ways, but where culture is not that central because it's not necessarily a question of identity as such. Yeah. Once politics becomes a question of identity, then you have an entirely transfigured relationship between culture and politics, and I would say for both good and ill. First of all, that movement into identity politics opens up whole areas of great value that many people on the traditional left had ignored, had overlooked. I think that's pretty obvious, you know. And there were people who always knew that there was something lacking. There were people who knew, let's say, ethnic activists of various kinds, sexual. They always knew that there had been something lacking in that culture, and now in that traditional form of politics, which was now trying to rectify itself, as it were, at the 11th hour. Yes. At the same time, identity politics became a refuge for those who realize that other forms, let's say more universal forms of activity, were not going to make it right now. And it's very hard. I mean, one reason why so many people on the left moved away from the left in the years, the end of the 20th century, I think, is simply because it's very hard to remain committed to struggles which don't seem to be delivering. I mean, there has to be something in it for you. There has to be something in it for people, to devote that amount of selflessness and passion and dedication to at a time when the capitalist state is riding high and is increasingly punitive and repressive, let alone what's happening now in the United States with that state. So that some people simply then dropped out of politics without, I think, necessarily rejecting socialism, but rather rejecting the concrete possibility of it. And those are different things, You don't have to move far to the right to be in that situation. But there were other people who found different forms of politics which were sometimes compensation or displacement for the failures of the left in other ways, and sometimes were, at the same time, were very often immensely valuable contributions to emancipatory politics at the same time. I think one has to look at that, as it were, dialectically. I mean, on any estimate, identity, being impoverished and humiliated in your identity is a profound source of political passion and dissent. Yes, we know that. At the same time, speaking out of the other side of one's mouth, as it were, what rules the world isn't sexuality, and it's not gender, and it's not ethnicity, and it's not culture, it's capital. And we are the people who try, in not propitious circumstances, to go on pointing out that blatantly obvious fact at a time when it's being shuffled to the side or covered over or given some other or name or whatever. I mean, people sometimes ask me, people from some boring newspaper, the Daily Mail or something, they say, do you believe in revolution? Well, I feel like saying, do you mean you don't? I mean, what? You mean you can actually look around the world, even the world portrayed by the Daily Mail, and see what's going on. I mean, are you so stupid that you think that we could have the kind of justice and friendship that we want without the most radical transformation of what you see out there? Because if you don't believe that, you're a fool. However many degrees you may have, yeah. That remains. It seems to me, that sense of the urgency of the situation remains after everything else. So,
Moltes gràcies, professor Eagleton. Moltes gràcies a vosaltres. Ens indiquen que ja s'ha acabat la conversa i, per tant, amb aquesta interpel·lació final tanquem la conversa. Moltes gràcies.
Busquem preguntes diferents. Nosaltres som la població la que hem de començar a esbrinar.
És aquí on el llibre esdevé una persona sense canvi, que projecten idees, que dialoguen